Sachas Megillah Daf Chaf Vav is the first daf in the fourth parak of the Masechta. We begin the last two lines on the Daf Chaf Hey, which begins the parak with the Mishnah. The topic which is being discussed here is that of how you deal with items which have kedusha. Are you allowed to sell it? If you do sell it, what could you do with the money? What status does the item itself, whether it's a shul, so it would be the building of the shul, or a Sefer Torah, or something like that, what status does that item have? The daf will focus mostly on shuls. Are you allowed to sell a shul? Who has ownership of the shul to sell it? If you can sell it, the kedusha may transfer to the money. What are you allowed to do with the money? What can you do with the building? If you just have the bricks of the shul, what can you do with that? And what can you do with the land of the shul? Towards the end of the daf, we'll also talk about other tashmishay kedusha, other items which have kedusha, and how you can properly discard or dispose of them. So let's begin. So the Mishnah discusses the fact that when you sell something, the kedusha of that object transfers to the money, and you're not allowed to use that money to purchase something of lower level kedusha. You can only go up or stay equal. You cannot go down the ladder of kedusha. And the Mishnah therefore lists what the steps upwards are. And the lowest level it begins with is the main town square, which the Gemara explains has some kedusha to it according to this Mishnah, because on a fast day, where a fast day was set up for a lack of rain, or a fast day that was set up as part of Ma'amados, as part of the special tefillos that were performed by Yisraelim representing Klal Yisrael for the carbon and Tamid. These things took place in the town square. So that town square was sometimes used for tefillah, therefore it has some kedusha. So if you're going to sell the town square, you can use the money to buy a shul, which is a higher level kedusha because it's a permanent place of tefillah, but you cannot use it to buy anything else. If you're going to sell a shul, you can use the money to buy an aron. If you're going to sell an aron, you could use the money to buy the cloth wrapping of the Sefer Torah. If you'll sell the cloth, you can go up the ladder to buy Sfarim of Nevi'im Ksuvim. Sfarim, you can use that money from the sale to buy a Torah itself. You cannot go in the opposite direction, down from Torah to Sfarim, from Sfarim to cloth covering, to Aron, to Shul, to town square. You can't do any of those things. Okay, so now the Gemara begins. The Gemara says that this Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Menachem Bar Yosi Stumta, who hold that a town square has some kedusha, but the Chachamim disagree, and they say that no, the fact that it's used for fast days every now and then is too infrequent of a usage. It does not give it a permanent status of kedusha, and therefore you can do whatever you want with it. You don't need to worry about it. Okay, now the Gemara begins focusing on the concept of the selling of a shul. So the Gemara first discusses, are you allowed to sell a shul in the first place? The Gemara says it really depends who owns the shul. In a small village, where the only people who really come to use the shul are the people who live in the village, they're the ones who paid for the building of the shul, they're the ones who use the shul, it's theirs, and they can choose to sell it as one if they want. In a big city, however, it's open to everybody. People from all over come and use the shul, and other Rishonim say people from all over actually contribute to the construction of the shul. It's a machlokes Rishonim whether the issue here is the usage of the shul or the construction and the costs of the shul. But either way, it's a public shul, it's used by many people. It does not belong only to the people of the city. People come from other cities and use it, and therefore nobody has ownership of the shul. It's not considered to belong to anybody, and nobody's allowed to sell it. That's halacha said by Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani in the name of Rav Yonasan. The Gemara is going to have a kasha on this. The Gemara first asks from an incident that happened with Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says that the shul of Machasya, which is a big city, so he says you're allowed to sell that. Why are you allowed to sell that? So the Gemara explains, because the people who came there only came because of Rav Ashi. Rishonim have different ways of understanding. Either they came to hear the shir from him, or they only contributed in his honor. And the shul was really built for him and under him, and therefore it's really considered his. And if he signs off on the sale, then he has ownership of it, and he's allowed to sell that shul. But now the Gemara has a kasha from a statement of Rabbi Huda. So Rabbi Yehuda says it was a shul which was built by the coppersmiths in Yerushalayim, and they sold it to Rabbi Eliezer, and he used it for his own personal needs. Now the fact that he used the building for his own personal needs indicates, first of all, that the building doesn't maintain the kedusha goes to the money. But second of all, it indicates that it was a valid sale, because if it wouldn't be a valid sale, the kedusha would stay on the building, it wouldn't transfer to the money. So how is he allowed to sell it? It's a shul of Yerushalayim, it's a shul of a big city, it's open to everybody, should be owned by everyone. Someone says, no, this was not the common public shul, this was only the shul of the coppersmiths. Since it's only for the coppersmiths, it was built and funded and used only by them, they are owners of it and they're allowed to sell it. Okay, now the Gemara has a kasha from Rabbi Isa discussing which which structures in Eretz Yisrael can become tamei if they get tsaras. We know there's such thing as tsaras on a building. So the Gemara has a drasha that says that it only applies to a building that belongs to an inheritance. It was divided up amongst the shvatim, like it says, beveis eretz achuzaschem, in the land of your inheritance. Only something which was inherited by the shvatim, which is divided up amongst them, that is susceptible to the halachos of tumas tsaras. Other buildings which are not privately owned by the shvatim, or one individual shevet that is, they are not susceptible to the rules of tsaras. The Gemara also, Rashi also points out that it has to belong to an individual, it can't belong to the public, because it says asher lo habayis, it has to have one owner, who can come and look at it and come talk to the Kohen about it. So anyway, so we have a Mishnah here which discusses the halachos of Yerushalayim. So it's a machlokes whether Yerushalayim's structures in general could have negayim. Rabbi Yehuda says yes, you could have negayim on all buildings in Yerushalayim. They were inherited, they were divided up between Shevet Yehuda and Shevet Binyamin, and therefore they are considered to be an inheritance like everything else. The Chachamim disagree and they say no, all of Yerushalayim was not divided. Yerushalayim is a generally owned thing. It was not divided, doesn't belong to any specific shevet, and therefore it's not achuzaschem. Now, the Mishnah says, however, that Rabbi Yehuda says, and presumably the Chachamim agree, there's no indication that they argue, that the Beis HaMikdash is different. The Beis HaMikdash is publicly owned. That's a Makam Kodesh, and Rabbi Yehuda says, Lo Shemati Ela Makam Mikdash Bavad, that's a special place, and therefore there's no Tumas Tsaras on the Beis HaMikdash. Says the Gemara that it clearly implies that the Beis HaMikdash has no Tumas Tsaras, but other shuls do have Tumas Tsaras, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda. According to Chachamim, they don't, but that's for a different reason. But there's nothing about being a shul in a big city like Yerushalayim that precludes Tumas Tsaras. That's clear. Now, according to what we're saying, though, that it's publicly owned by everybody, because everybody comes and uses it, it shouldn't be susceptible to Tumas Tsaras. It shouldn't be called an achuzah, and you shouldn't be able to say, Asher Allah Habayis, the one who owns the house. So Gemara therefore says, so it's a kasha, why should a shul in Yerushalayim have susceptibility to tzara? So the Gemara answers. The Gemara says, we have to adjust what Rabbi Yehuda said slightly. It's not that he says, Lo Shemati Ela Makam Mikdash, it should be, Lo Shemati Ela Makam Mikudesh. I only found that a holy place has no susceptibility to tzaras, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda means to say the Beis HaMikdash and all other shuls don't have susceptibility to tzaras again because they're publicly owned. Right, now the Gemara goes into the machlokes as to whether or not Yerushalayim is called an achuzah, whether it belongs to the shatim, whether it was divided up. The Gemara wants to show a brisa that goes each way, one taking the side of Rabbi Yehuda and one taking the side of the Chachamim. So the Gemara quotes a brisa that discusses the division of Yerushalayim. It clearly shows that it's divided up amongst the shvatim, like Rabbi Yehuda said. And it says that the chelik of Yehuda extended into the Har HaBayis, and we'll describe it here moving from east to west across the structure of the Beis HaMikdash. So first you get into the wall of the Har HaBayis, you get into the open area of the Har HaBayis. That's all Shevet Yehuda, says the Brisa. Continuing on, you get to the Azaros, Ezras Nashim, Ezras Yisrael, Ezras Kohanim. These are all part of Yehuda. Then, between the last Azara wall, getting into the area of the Mizbeach. So you have the Mizbeach and the space between the Mizbeach and the building of the Beis HaMikdash, which is the Ulam, the Heichel, and the Kodashim. So that whole space area is divided up as follows. As far as the area of the Mizbeach itself, that was a strip that extended out of Yehuda's territory and included the area under the Mizbeach, but not to the south, north, or west. West, north, and south of the Mizbeach was already Shevet Binyamin, and everything to the west of all that, including the Ulam, the Heichal, and Kodesh Kodashim, that was all the Chelek of Binyamin. It says Gemara, Binyamin was Mitzdayer, Binyamin himself saw through Ruach HaKodesh how this was set up and how the Mizbeach would be in the Chelek of Yehuda sticking into his territory, and he was upset about it. The Gemara says is the meaning of the Pasuk Chayfif of Kol Hayom. He was distressed about it all day long. The Gemara says, the Brisa says it was a schus for Binyamin, and he became the host for the Shechina, that the Aron itself was in his Chelek. Now, so that's a brisa which clearly says that Yerushalayim was divided up amongst the Shvatim, and there's another brisa that says that it was not. And this brisa says that when people came to Yerushalayim for Aliyah L'Regel, they did not have to pay rent. They would stay in people's houses, they did not have to pay rent, and the reason was because nobody owned the homes in Yerushalayim. They were considered to be a public city, didn't belong to any shevet, nobody could collect rent on it. However, they did get compensated in the fact that they took the hides of the korbanos. They took the skins of the korbanei kachim kalam, the korbanos shlamim, and they could even take it by force, the Gemara says, because that was their recompense, their compensation for having people staying in their house. The Gemara says from here you learn that it's derech eretz to leave something and bring something for your host. If you stay in someone's house, leave a jug, leave a hide, leave a skin, leave something to honor your host. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the concept of selling a shul. The Gemara said you can only use the money to buy something of a higher level kedusha because the money gets the kedusha of the shul. So now the Gemara says that's limited. That's only if the sale is not performed by the 7 leaders of the city, the 7 elders of the city, in the presence and the agreement of the townspeople themselves. If, however, you do that, you sell it in the presence of the townspeople, then you can use the money for whatever you want. You can use the land for whatever you want because the kedusha comes off. Says the Gemara, you can even use it to buy beer, to drink beer, should you happen to want to. Now the Gemara has a couple of incidents here. The Gemara says Ravina had a collapsed base knesses, a collapsed shul on his property, and he wanted to know if he could plow over the land. So the Gemara says he went and asked Rav Ashi advised him, sell it in the presence of the 7 Tovei, the 7 elders of the city, in the presence of the townspeople, and then all the kedusha will go off, and you could use it, you could plow with it, you could do whatever you want. Now, generally, you're not supposed to plow an area that has kedusha. It's not that it's a lower kedusha use, because the building itself doesn't get kedusha that you can't use for a lower use. That transfers to the money, usually, but the building itself, even when you normally sell it, still has a certain dignity to it. You can't use it for degrading use. However, if you sell in the presence of the 7 Tovei with the townspeople, all that goes off and there's no problem. Okay, now the Gemara discusses Rami bar Ava. The Gemara says he had a shul, he had an old shul, and he wanted to knock it down and use the bricks and the beams to build a new shul. The problem was that the halakha is you're not allowed to knock down a shul until you've already built its replacement. So he was wondering, can I do it here? Can I knock it down first in order to use the bricks and the beams to help build a replacement? So he was thinking about it, didn't come up with an answer. He went and asked for Papa and Rav Huna, and they both told him it's usher. You're not allowed to. Okay, going further, the Gemara says a few more halachos here. The Gemara says that a shul, you're allowed to swap for something. You're allowed to sell it. If you do that, the building itself loses its kedusha. It still has halachos of dignity, but it loses its kedusha. It transfers onto the money, or it transfers onto the thing that you're swapping it for. This is referring to without the 7 Tovei here. However, you're not allowed to rent the shul or mortgage it to some other use, because since you're not permanently changing ownership, it still has the kedusha of the shul, and therefore cannot be used for another shul. Now, as far as the bricks, so you're allowed to sell them, you're allowed to swap them, you're not allowed to lend them to anything, because they still have kedusha. Gemara says that only refers to bricks that were part of a shul that was used. New bricks that were made to be put into a shul don't have kedusha. So now the Gemara says this is related to the concept of hazmana milsa. If you prepare something for a certain use, does it get the status of that use already? So that's usually a machlokas. And machlokas is about if somebody weaves a cloth in order to use for tzitzis or as a shroud for the dead, which is a mitzvah. So the fact that he made the cloth and it was intended to be used for that purpose means it's set aside for the mitzvah, it's reserved for the mitzvah, it gets the laws of that mitzvah object. Says Gemara, this is different though, because this is just bricks. If you would have built a building to use as a shul, it would get kedusha, because then you're making the finished product. Here you're just making bricks, you just have bricks. The bricks are not a finished product, so the bricks, even though you intended to build them in the shul, that's just making raw materials to use for a building which you intend to use as a shul. That would be like somebody who spins thread in order to weave a cloth, in order to use that as tachrichin for the dead. That would not go into that machlokas, so that everyone would agree did not have kedusha yet. Alright, now the Gemara discusses what happens if you give a gift with a davar shebekdusha. Let's say if you give a shul as a gift, does that take the kedusha off? There is no money for the kedusha to transfer to, so what happens there? So Gemara says it's a machlokas between Rav and Ravina. One says that the kedusha goes off the shul, and one says it does not. The one who says that it does not go off is because there's nothing for it to transfer to. The one who says that it does go off says that if you're giving something away, you're doing it for a reason. You're getting something out of it. You're getting some hana. So the kedusha transfers to that hana, whatever it is that you got out of it. All right, now the Gemara discusses other objects which have kedusha, not shuls. Gemara brings a brisa that divides up into two categories: tashmishe mitzvah and tashmishe kedusha. Tashmishe mitzvah are items which are used for a standard regular mitzvah, like sukkah, lulav, shofar, tzitzis. Kedusha, tashmishe kedusha are things which were used for sifrei Torah, tefillin, and mezuzos, such as the bag, the wrapping of the sefer Torah, the bag of the tefillin and the mezuzah, and things like that. Also the retzuas, the straps of the tefillin. Those are all called tashmishe kedusha. So the Gemara now brings a number of examples, a number of halachos. So the Gemara says, Rava says, I used to think that the bima was a tashmish detashmish, something which is not itself serve a sefer Torah, but it serves something which serves the sefer Torah, because you put a cloth on top of the bima and the Torah on top of the cloth. Then he says, I saw that people would put the sefer Torah sometimes directly on the bima, and therefore I said it is a tashmish of kedusha and has these halachos. Now, as far as the curtain inside the aron, hanging around the walls of the aron, Rava says, I also used to think that was a tashmish of a tashmish. It served the aron, which served the sefer Torah. Then Rava said, but I saw sometimes it flattens the bottom of it, trails onto the floor of the aron, the bottom of the aron, and the sefer Torah actually rests upon it, and therefore it is a tashmish to kedusha, and I would have these halachos. Says Rava further, if you have an aron which fell apart, you're allowed to use the wood to make another aron, a smaller aron, but you can't use it to make a bima, because that's lower level kedusha. Says Rava another halacha, any wrapping or the bag or the box of svarim, you're allowed to use for an equal level svarim. So if it's from a sefer Torah, you're allowed to use it to make one for another sefer Torah. But you can't use it to make for a chumash. Chumash would be a scroll that has only one of the four chumshei Torah in it, that doesn't have the same level of kedusha as the sefer Torah itself. Says Rava, a case or a box of svarim are tashmishe kedusha, and they require geniza. They have to be put into shemis. Gemara says that's pashut. The answer is the reason this is a chiddush is because you may think that they don't actually do anything for the sefer; they just protect it, and therefore it doesn't count as a shimush. But no, it does count as a shimush. Now the Gemara brings an incident. There was a shul built by the Jews of Rome, and it was next to a room where the Chaver Kedisha worked on the dead, and there was a door that opened from one to the other. And during the time where there was a dead person in that room, the tumah would go from that room into the shul, because the halacha is that a tumah goes out through a doorway, unless you know where the mace is planning to leave the room through. The tumah goes out through the doorways. The problem is then Kohanim were not allowed into the shul. So the Kohanim wanted to be able to use the shul for a tefillah, so they went and asked Rava what to do. So Rava said, move the aron in front of the doorway. The aron is a box. It's a kli, which is not meant to be moved. The halacha is that a kli, which is made out of wood, which is not a mobile object, it's meant to be stationary, it's large enough, it's meant to stay in one spot, that is not makabel tumah. If it's not makabel tumah, then it also blocks the tumah from going out through the doorway. So Gemara says that the Chachamim said, but this aron is moved. It's used when they want to read from the Sefer Torah. They use it as a bima sometimes. So that's the case. Rava retracted that. He said, no, then you wouldn't be able to use it. It would not block tumah, because then it is makabel tumah, because it's not big enough. It's not a stationary object. Okay, the Gemara goes further. The Gemara says, what can you do with worn out covers of Sifrei Torah? So Marzutcha says you could use it to make shrouds for a mace mitzvah, for a person that it's a mitzvah to do kfur for, because he died without any money to care for him. Now, by doing that, you'll end up doing geniza. You'll end up storing those worn out cloths in the ground, because they'll be used as a shroud for this individual. Says Gemara, Sefer Torah itself, which is worn out, should be buried, and it should be put in with a Talmud Chacham. Even somebody who doesn't know Torah Psukim too well, somebody who just knows halacha, so this is not his area of expertise, still the worn out sefer should be together with the Talmud Chacham. Now, Rav Achabar Yaakov says you should put it in a kli cheres, in an earthenware kli, because that will stop it from disintegrating so quickly. Like it says, you should put it in the kli cheres and it'll stay for a long time. Alright, now the Gemara compares a shul to a beis medrash, a place where we daven to a place where we learn? Should we have separate buildings for that? The Gemara says that the machlokas, which one is higher level kedusha, and which one you're allowed to use the money from the sale of one to buy the other. So Rav Papi says the Beis Medrash has more kedusha than a shul, and Rav Papa, in the name of Rava, says the opposite: a shul is more kedusha than a Beis Medrash. The Gemara says that Rav Papi is more logical because Rav Yeshua ben Levi has said that a shul can be made into a Beis Medrash, but not vice versa.